We've made it to week 3, folks. This week we are looking at various portrayals of the goddess Athena and ways in which those portrayals can ripple out to give us a sense of all of the Olympians and the shenanigans that they get up to. First, I do have to acknowledge my own bias here. I used to be an Athena fangirl. The whole time I was growing up and reading mythology, I thought, wow, she does wisdom and war and crafts. And man, look at the ways that she can be almost a fairy godmother for some of the heroes in their stories. She's amazing. And now that I've read a little bit more, now that more of the myths are actually getting front and center, her characterization, much like the characterization of many of the Olympians, becomes more problematic the longer we look at it. And I think that in itself is telling because it shows us that the Greeks and Greek culture simply didn't have the same notions of divinity that those of us who have been impacted by the Judeo-Christian theological perspective have. Their gods are not necessarily perfect or omniscient. Their gods are far more likely to reflect some of the things about ourselves that we can find most alarming. So, with that in mind, a quick word on weaving. And lest you think that this is a complete non sequitur, it's related, I promise. It's not just the avenue in which Athena and Arachne have a competition. Weaving in the ancient world was absolutely crucial in the lives not just of women, but of the whole society. Women were the ones who did that work. Weaving was one of the few artistic outlets in which women could participate, but weaving was essential. I'm looking down at myself, and as I look at my Coles ensemble that I'm wearing, I realize our perspective is going to be vastly different about clothing, about linens, than it would have been even 150 years ago. So I say that because in the scope of human history, we're the weird ones. Even as recently as the Victorians, we've realized that one thing that hasn't come down to us much would be clothing. We have jewelry, we have paintings, we have sculptures, but we don't have a whole lot of clothing. And everyone wore it. Why don't we have much? That's because cloth was such a valuable commodity. It was so important that even when clothing could no longer be worn, or even when the original wearer died, that cloth would be repurposed. For example, my main gal, Queen Elizabeth I of England, the one who was on the throne when Shakespeare was writing, she had all of these fancy clothes, and nothing comes down to us, except they found in one of the cathedrals in Britain an altar cloth that had been made from the cloth of one of her gowns. So even as recently, comparably as that, cloth was being repurposed. Every towel, every bedsheet, every blanket, every diaper, every tunic would have to have been woven by hand. Many poorer people wouldn't own more than a couple of sets of clothing in their lifetime. The notion that we have of hand-me-downs would have been far more pervasive. And so everything in the home, everything that would be used, had to be literally spun right there. So women were constantly spinning. And so when we associate Athena, who's given a lot of masculine qualities, she's a goddess of war, she's a strategist, she's a politician, she appears frequently as an advisor. All of these are masculine qualities. And yet, she also doesn't want to lose any credibility as a feminine producer of art and of useful items, right? She wants to have that cachet. All right. So that was my little bit about the importance of cloth and weaving. So when we get down to it, there are other elements within the Arachne Athena competition that are probably worth noting. One thing I didn't realize on my first, 50 times through the myth or so, in my younger days, was that in many of our oldest sources, they go to a lot of trouble to tell us that Arachne was not necessarily the daughter of a king. She wasn't necessarily that important in terms of nobility or bloodline. But she had distinguished herself because of her artistry. Now, within this course, when we're talking about agency, and when we're talking about how one's accomplishments can distinguish one from others, to be that accomplished a woman, for people to be talking for miles around about how talented, how artistic, how brilliant you are, would have been incredibly rare. Women, after all, were supposed to weave in the home. The best woman, according to our political figure of Athens, Pericles, the best woman is a woman of whom one says nothing. Arachne was already pushing the envelope because it wasn't enough to be good. She wanted to be famous for being good. All right, dangerous woman. But where she really crosses the line, in Athena's perspective anyway, is when she says, no. I mean, I know Athena's a goddess and all, but my accomplishment couldn't rival hers. My work is so exemplary that there's no fault to be found in it. This is another area in which she butts right up against the Greek concept of hubris, or overwhelming pride, not only because she's comparing herself to a goddess, but because she is saying that as a woman, she can produce work that is that incomparable. So this is another element that is going to creep in through their competition. Now, Athena occupies her own strange space. We've already read about the Olympians. You've gotten a little bit more familiar with the fact that she has her own strange origin story, from bursting quite literally out of Zeus's head, fully grown in armor, ta-da, thanks to her mother, the Titan Metis, whom Zeus has quite literally consumed in order to control her wisdom and power, and in order to marshal it himself whenever he wishes. That's not a statement on masculine dominance at all, is it? So, Athena is not like the other Olympians. Athena is also unlike the other Olympians in that she is one of only 3 maiden goddesses. She will not submit to marriage. She has no desire for that. She has no desire for a partner. Um, and unlike Artemis, who is frequently associated with lesbianism, Athena seems to prefer the company of men, and yet she never really wants a partner of any sort. So if you've got Artemis, who leans towards potential lesbianism, if you have Hestia, who is the goddess of the hearth, who's kind of associated with the notion of the old crone, then you've got Athena, who is in a quite literal no man's land, and yet she doesn't seem to have any one group to which she belongs. She is, again, her own sort of outlier. So on the surface, you've got a proud goddess who doesn't like being compared to a mere mortal. But there are also things like pride and accomplishment, like an unwillingness to submit to status quo, that should unite both of these figures. And that notion of the connections between them also comes up again because it turns out that by and large, they weave the same stories in their tapestries. They just do a very different version of these stories. Athena's, of course, makes the gods look wise and virtuous, and Arachne's shows just how petty, vengeful, and pointless the gods might be. So let's look at a couple of the stories that are laid out for us and look at how we can read them in these two distinct ways. I will not, for the sake of time and your sanity, go through each element of each of these nesting doll stories. But there are a few that I think are quite important. Prometheus. Many of us are familiar with him. He is well known as the Titan who tricks Zeus and gives people access to fire. And with fire, we can have settlement. And with fire, we can have civilization. And with fire, we can live longer. We can tell stories into the night. We can come together as community for feasting, for celebration. And all of this flies in the face of Zeus's desire for dominance. And I think it is worth discussing for just a second that in the Greek creation, we exist on the same level of every other animal and critter in the minds of the gods. We are to be used. We are to worship. But that's not a worship based on love or relationship. It's a worship based on fear and awe. So, when Zeus pops back around and he sees that suddenly we aren't like all the other critters, that we are talking and living in these rich and diverse and nuanced communities, he is not best pleased. So, when we look at Prometheus and the punishment that he receives, it's pretty striking. Of course, Zeus has him chained to a rock. Every day, an eagle comes and devours his liver. And all of this is to once again reassert Zeus's dominance and control. But of course, it's just too late. Humanity has already pulled itself up by the bootstraps, and there's no real way of keeping us in our place. Whew. But in this week's reading, we got even a little bit more nuance. And that is that in many of the oldest tales, the ones that were not necessarily as popular in a post-Christian world, and so they weren't as widely circulated throughout most of Europe. Um, Prometheus didn't just sneak in and steal fire. Instead, he was able to establish all kinds of norms for us humans, including fire, because Zeus was AWOL. Zeus was out. Zeus wasn't paying attention to, Earth for years. And so Prometheus wasn't going in like a super Hollywood heist and grabbing that spark in the wee hours of the night. No, no, no. There was time. All of this happened because of Zeus's own laissez-faire approach. So that makes it seem, if you're Arachne, like Zeus is not only arrogant, not only uninterested, but he's also really bad at his job. He doesn't pay attention to what's going on, and then because he realizes he hasn't been paying attention to what's going on, instead of taking any kind of accountability, he throws a hissy fit and decides to punish Prometheus. And of course, Athena would see it as Zeus asserting his rightful control as king of the Olympians. You folks didn't stay in your lane. Prometheus was a rebel. And Arachne presents Prometheus as a rebel, sure, but as a rebel against a bad ruler, an absent ruler. So that's one distinction that's important. The other one that I really want to lean into for a minute is the notion of Pandora. Again, many of us will know that story, but within the context of these sources that are actually going back to some of the oldest pieces that have been uncovered recently from archaeology, carved on urns, mosaics that have been recently found, this notion that Pandora was used as a pawn for years before having the urn that released suffering into the world is pretty extraordinary. And I say that because traditionally, and even in Athena's version, Pandora is shown as the idiot who simply can't follow directions. She does what she's instructed not to do, opens the darn urn to see what's in it, and hints trouble. So just like in the Eve story, when you get down to it, blame the woman for the cruel suffering of humanity. But within Arachne's version, within the version you actually read, it's very different. Pandora is, yes, formed as a sort of Trojan horse by Hephaestus, the great craftsman of the Olympians. Athena helps, so there is some planning, some strategy, some intellect involved. But deployed by Zeus, marries Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, and lives among all of the people for quite a long time before the urn is introduced. In other words, not only are the humans lured into a false sense of security, Pandora herself has no reason to think that the gods intend her harm. She has no reason to think that she shouldn't trust those who have created her. So in this take on the tale, in the take that Arachne can give us, it's really the gods and their trickiness, the gods and their willingness to hold grudges against innocent people, not just the one guy who did something they didn't like. It is that kind of cruel craftiness that sets up humanity's fall, not just Pandora's curiosity. So again, this is a way in which, depending on how one reads the story, one receives a very different kind of story. Likewise, many of you noted in your first week of responses that, golly gee, these cycles keep repeating ourselves. We have Uranus, and then we have Kronos, and if they aren't similar in the ways in which they enact very similar patterns of brutality and attacking, limiting, consuming their children, keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same result. We see that in another way in this tapestry when we see Gaia, the earth, the being who didn't want her first set of children consumed or imprisoned. She doesn't like the fact that her grandson, Zeus, has imprisoned all of the Titans. So she declares a kind of war. She tries to break some of the monsters out. There's this enormous conflict in heaven. And so we see the Olympians literally waging war against the earth and life itself. And of course, that comes down to Athena casting herself in a heroic role where she and Hephaestus equip Zeus with lightning. She and Hercules help Zeus to pin down the great Titan Typhon, the monster that Gaia has created. And we see her giving herself this heroic role in the War of the Gods. Great, wonderful, check, have that t-shirt. But wait a minute, just out of curiosity. This is a war that's all about imprisoning people that creation doesn't want imprisoned. Is that really a great look? Is it a great look to say, but we were more powerful, and so we're imprisoning people even if they never actually fought us because they might? Looking at it from an ethical perspective, gotta give this one to Arachne. This is not a tremendously positive look. What are we supposed to do with this notion that Typhon, who is pinned by a literal mountain, is punished, imprisoned, tortured, along with all of his brothers and sisters, simply because they might threaten the existing power dynamic? Ooh. Again, Arachne has a point. The last story I will lean into with much depth is one that I considered assigning 2 different books to. But I thought, no, really, this is one that could steal the entire course if I'm not careful. And that is the abduction of Persephone by Hades and the resulting response from Persephone's mom, the goddess of the harvest, Demeter. So a little backstory. I was this many years old when I came across some sources that pointed out that in the original or oldest versions that we have of the story, Hades didn't abduct Persephone at all. Well, technically. Because Hades, Zeus's brother, Zeus is Persephone's father, because Zeus slept with his sister Demeter and had Persephone. Y'all, the ancient world's a mess. So Uncle Hades goes to Papa Zeus and says, "Hey, I think Persephone is just a cutie pie. I want to marry her." And Papa Zeus looks at his brother and says, "Sure, sounds like a great deal." So Hades has already brokered a marriage arrangement with Persephone's father. It's just that neither father nor potential groom bothers to tell the bride or the mother of the bride about the arrangement. So there's a statement. In other words, legally, yeah, papas can give away their daughters to whomever they choose, but it's not a recipe for domestic happiness not to at least have a conversation. Part 2. Hades steals Persephone, who is, in most versions of the story, between 12 and 15, while she is picking flowers. Typical marriage age in Greece was around 14 after puberty. So she is right on the cusp of being eligible for marriage when this happens. Takes her down to the underworld where she is imprisoned. No one bothers to tell Demeter, who, of course, panics when her daughter disappears. What's going on? So Demeter wanders the entire earth, as you read. Demeter gets up to her own shenanigans with baby Demophon and some of the other people she meets, where she tries to impart some gifts, but is mostly just desperately looking for any clue of her daughter. And it is only the goddess of witchcraft, Hecate, or Hecate, who is willing to finally, after months, clue Demeter in on the secret. Well, by this time, poor Persephone is intensely desperate. She wants and is pleading daily to go home. Hades has not yet raped or assaulted her in most of the versions that we have, although he is withholding access to communication. It's a bad situation. Now, this is where it gets interesting and tricky. Version you read, Hades quite literally forces her to eat. And once she's eaten, she is connected to the underworld forever. Many versions show that there was a temptation element rather than force that was used. And in a few versions, she actually simply chooses to eat and to stay in the world with Hades, at least part-time. Of course, because she's only eaten a few seeds, she's allowed to go back up to Olympus, back up to Earth for most of the year, but she spends a portion. Now, we can clearly see Arachne's version of, y'all, this is about as messed up as it gets. We have kidnapping. We have marriage without any kind of consent. We have the withholding of communication, contact, food. This is not right. And yet we also can see Athena chooses not to focus on anything other than Hades' strength. She does try to focus on Demeter's commitment to her daughter. This is a little bit more contentious between the perspective of the gods and of the humans, although I'm pretty confident in saying that in the 21st century, most of us would be Team Arachne on this one too. This is a terrible story on its surface. It gets a little more complicated, aside, because Hades is the only god who never cheats on his wife. In time, Persephone and Hades develop a, I'm not going to say happy relationship in all of the Greek sources, but certainly a more respectful relationship mutually than we see with Zeus and Hera or many of the other big couples of mythology. And so that is a complication. Throw in the fact that in the 21st century, a lot of writers are trying to absolutely lean into the romance and to portray Hades as a way out and a way for Persephone to have access to more power and authority and independence. It gets real messy. But when we're looking at the initial story that we're given, we absolutely see the might and power of the gods versus the unethical way in which they act. And that is at the heart of this entire tapestry. Athena keeps saying, look at how powerful we are. We can wipe out humanity with a flood. Ha ha. Then we can tell humans to throw some rocks over their shoulder and voila, we can make a whole new group of people. We're awesome. Look at our ability and our strength. And Arachne is off to the side saying, yeah, you can do that, but it's a really crappy, lousy, terrible, unethical move. And that's the crux of the competition. It is telling that when it's a virtual tie, Athena uses her superior strength to destroy Arachne's creation. And then when Arachne is devastated that she is simply being silenced, that Athena wouldn't engage in real debate, but that Athena goes with the Olympian move of deploying brute strength, Arachne kills herself. And then Athena does something else. Most of the readings say, oh, Athena felt so bad. She felt so bad for Arachne. She brought her back as a spider so she could always spin. So bad. Is it guilt? Or is it that Athena wants Arachne to continue spinning? She doesn't want her to have the out of death. Instead, she's going to keep Arachne in a kind of holding pattern. And I don't know about you, I am often very impressed when I'm out for a walk with the intricacy of spider webs in the morning sunlight. They're beautiful. They can be astounding. But they do not tell a story. They do not compare with the spinning and weaving of Athena. I think that is worth noting. I will say all too briefly, because Medusa is worth so much conversation. I will say that once again, we see the power of brute strength in Medusa's story. We are going to see Medusa first physically overpowered by Poseidon in a place where she thinks she should have sanctuary. And then because Athena cannot punish Uncle Poseidon, Athena punishes Medusa. It's all about strength. It's all about pride when we're looking at the Olympians. They may be astounding. They may have some fabulous stories, but these are terrible, fundamentally unethical beings.